Well, good afternoon, viewers. I'm joined this afternoon by my lovely colleague, Louise Uphill. Hello, Louise.
Hi, Paul.
Very odd, because we normally sit in reasonable close proximity to each other in the office, but now we appear to be side by side, all be separated by about 10 miles or so, which isn't bad, because I did one of these calls the other day with someone in India. So the idea of this afternoon is Louise is a leasehold expert in relation to matters of enfranchisement. I just play at it like I do everything else, hence that's why I'm wearing a football shirt. Louise is the proper expert here, so I wanted to pick her brains for the viewers. And so we've entitled this session, Louise's Leasehold Lockdowns, where I'll ask you 5 questions that I think leaseholders should be aware of and things they should be prepping for and possibly thinking about in relation to the leasehold properties they've got. So without further ado, question 1, what can leaseholders do to maximise their assets at the moment?
Well, at the moment, they can start thinking about lease extensions when they've got flats or even houses, I suppose, but that's a different subject. But for flats, they could extend their leases now because then it makes it more marketable, ready for when they come to sell their properties. They've got a bit of time at the moment whilst the market's sort of stopped at the moment. I suppose I know it's getting re-going, but this is a really good time. And there are several ways you can do lease extensions. You can do them on an informal deal where you negotiate with your landlord directly, or you can do a statutory claim, provided they've owned their property for 2 years. They can then start their statutory claim to get a lease extension. And that's much like compulsory purchase. So once the notice is served, and as long as it's served correctly, then they can have a 90-year extension on top of their existing term, and ground rent comes down to 0, which we call a peppercorn.
So basically, if I was a leaseholder and I wanted to extend my lease, then I've got a couple of options. It doesn't matter how long I've owned it for, there are still possibilities that I could extend my lease.
Yes, yeah. So yeah, that's right. So when you've got if you've owned it for 2 years, you can have a statutory claim because you qualify under the statutory legislation. But if you haven't owned it for 2 years, you could have an informal discussion with your landlord to look at lease extension that way.
Okay. So my second question, I suppose, is how easy is it to start a lease extension?
So it's quite easy. So the first thing you want to think about is who you're going to instruct. So that would be, you need to look at...
I wonder if I need good leasehold lawyers.
So you want to be looking at people that specialise in the area. So that's solicitors and valuers. But in terms of a voluntary deal, so an informal deal, you could open up discussions with your managing agent or your landlord at an early stage. They are likely to say to you, well, you need to pay for the landlord to have a valuation so we can see how much the landlord wants for his lease extension. So often you have to put an upfront cost there. The risk is with the voluntary deals that they do tend to drag on a little bit. So the longer you wait for the voluntary deal to come through, the lease is still depreciating in terms of years left on that lease. But with a statutory claim, again, it's a case of talking to a qualified surveyor. We can recommend lots of surveyors, and then speaking to a specialist whilst the valuation's being undertaken. Someone like myself or you, Paul, we would draft the notices whilst the valuation's being done. And once the notice is served, then that stops the clock from ticking in terms of that lease depreciating. That's the main difference. With a statutory claim, you can really stop the lease depreciating. It's sort of a virtual thing, doesn't actually physically stop it depreciating. But in terms of the valuation, the premium you pay is calculated as at the date that you serve the notice for a statutory claim.
Okay, so we talked about leaseholds. My third question, I suppose, is what if I wanted to buy the freehold to my flat or the freehold to the block? Is that easy to do?
Yeah, it takes a little bit more organisation, which is why now's a really great time to do it. It's called collective enfranchisement, where you all collect together, all leaseholders in the block get together and they buy their freehold together. It's a statutory process, the same piece of legislation, and it is the same sort of procedure. You serve a notice, you need to get a valuation report. But the crucial difference is there's lots of you all together, and it can sometimes be like herding cats. or juggling jelly, I've likened it to. And actually, these things can take a lot of time to get off the ground. So you need great management. You need to be able to manage the group. You need a point of contact. And now is a great time. I've been talking to lots of leaseholders because you can have these conversations via Zoom, Skype. You don't actually have to physically be in the same meeting room together anymore, whereas that would often be a bit of a barrier. Some people were in, like you say, India or Australia or wherever. Now they can all just speak together over these conference calls, and it is slightly easier. I can, as a solicitor, I can get involved. I don't have to travel for hours to get to the group where they're physically residing. Surveyors can come onto these calls. So the difference with the purchase of freehold, to answer your question, is it's easy, yes, but it takes takes a lot of coordination. And there's lots more things to think about in terms of how the group's going to move together with participation agreements and all that type of thing. It's just a lot more organisation.
So moving on from herding cats, which I love that analogy, my fourth question, which I imagine a lot of the viewers and certainly a lot of leaseholders will ask, is how much is it going to cost?
Right, so that's not a question we can answer, but that's the question that you'd ask your surveyor. So once you've had your initial conversations with your lawyers, the next thing to do would be to speak to the surveyor. They're the ones that can tell you how much is going to be worth when you either extend your lease or you buy your freehold. And as I said earlier, we've got lots of surveyor contacts that I've worked with over the years, I'm sure you've worked with as well, so that we can recommend that specialise in this area. They're the ones that will tell you what the parameters are going to be, because there's parts of the legislation that the parties can use to make the premiums lower or make the premiums higher. Won't bore you with the details, but essentially what you want your surveyor to be telling you is what those parameters are. In terms of other things you need to think about, there'll be legal costs, not only your own, but your landlord's costs, so they have to be paid, and also the same for the surveyor's costs as well. Landlord surveyors' costs have to be paid as well as your own surveyors. For lease extensions, there's a statutory deposit that you have to pay, which is 10% of the premium you propose. So that's something to factor in, because that's an upfront cost that gets deducted off the premium at the end when you complete. And if ever it goes to tribunal because parties can't agree on the valuation, then there's tribunal costs as well. But most cases don't necessarily have to go to tribunal if you're proactive and can get things agreed before the deadlines kick in.
Okay. So my fifth and final question would be, given the fact there's costs and given the fact that it will take time, what are the benefits to leaseholders about starting the process at a time like now?
With lease extensions, the benefit will be it's a great time. We're all sat at home. We can easily dust off the leases and work out what we've got left on our leases. So that's a really good time. And we've had a lot of inquiries recently because people have got the time to get round to doing this, because this is something that's often on people's to-do lists. They just don't get round to it. And now's a really great time because you can start these lease extensions. If you're thinking of selling, you can start them, especially with a statutory claim. You can start it off, and as you go through the sale process, when you complete the sale, you can assign the benefit of the lease extension claim to the new buyer, and they can carry on with it. So that's a really great mechanism because you're qualified because you've owned it for 2 years, but your buyer won't. So that's a great way of actually starting it off and passing it on, and just maximising the value of the asset. In terms of the benefits of freehold purchases, well, that's you can control your own destiny. When you own your own freehold, you can control insurance, you can control when the common parts are decorated, when they're lighted, when they're cleaned, all of those things that leaseholders are frustrated about with their landlords can be rectified. You can extend your leases once you've bought your freehold. So a lot of the problems like major works that come up, that landlords are demanding money, that often will kickstart leaseholders into wanting to buy their freehold. So really the overarching benefit there is simply to be able to control their own destiny.
So if I bought the freehold to a block of flats with my neighbours, could we agree that only Newcastle United fans live there?
No. No, you can't. You're still bound by your leases. I'm not sure that would be a covenant in the lease that landlords can only require certain people to live there. That wouldn't be allowed.
I'll be
Sorry.
campaigning for a change in the law at some point in the future then. Well, thanks very much for your time this afternoon, Louise. That's been great. I hope everyone that's been watching has found that useful. Louise's contact details will flash up along with the firm's details at the end of this. So if you do know someone or you yourself are considering extending your lease or buying your freehold, you know that this is the lady to contact. So thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Au revoir.
Bye.